So SX-70 film's a pretty remarkable feat of engineering when you think that the entire photographic process, that's like taking a photograph, developing a negative, printing the negative, developing the print, and then even framing the print, it's all done in one step. Just push a button and a finished frame print is ejected. But all that magic really comes with a few downsides. And the most concerning downside is that it has a limited latitude or dynamic range. Now, most camera films have a dynamic range of about 8 or 9 f-stops, ranging between black and white. SX-70 has a much smaller dynamic range. It's extremely contrasty. The film loves low contrast scenes, unlike this one, shot in overcast conditions, but good luck trying to capture a bright sunny scene with deep shadows. So it occurred to me that the zone system might be a good way of harnessing that limited latitude. Now I'm going to take a little bit of a deep dive into the zone system here just as background. I'm going to assume that you don't know too much about the zone system, if anything at all. The zone system itself was developed by famous photographer Ansel Adams and Fred Archer in the 1930s. And this is his book, Ansel Adams' 1978 edition of his book Polaroid Land Photography. And in it, he says, it's a very good book, by the way, if you are serious about Polaroid photography, and the 78 edition has a lot about SX-70 photography in it as well. In it, he sort of states the objective of the zone system. He says, my objective was to bring the basics of sensitimetric facts out of the film manufacturers' laboratories and make them function within reasonable limits of accuracy in all aspects of applied photography, particularly in the realization of personal creative statements. In other words, the zone system is a means for the photographer to pre-visualize how a picture will appear in a negative in print by knowing how the film interprets the photographer's subject. So now I use the zone system myself throughout my black and white film days from the late 1970s to about the year 2000. And I worked with a whole range of cameras ranging from a swing lens 35mm panoramic camera to a 4x5 inch to several 4x5 inch large format cameras, such as the one in the background right here, my nice folding Zone 6 camera. And also finally a circuit number 6 outfit, which produced a full circle 6-inch by 60-inch negative. So what the zone system did is it allowed me to assess a scene and to figure out where all the tones were going to fall at a given exposure time and aperture setting, and whether I should alter my negative development, for example, to increase or decrease the contrast of the negative, and how the final print actually might look. And all that pre-visualization would take place before the camera's shutter release was even pressed. So just to show you an example, this is a picture taken with a 4x5 inch camera, and we'll just move this aside right here. So this is a picture that I took in 1978, and it's was taken in Carmen, Manitoba, here in just not far south from Winnipeg, which is my home base. But anyways, aside from that, when I was setting up my 4x5 camera here, I was using my exposure meter to assess the scene before I actually pressed the shutter. So I would be taking a reading of this stucco right here, and the stucco is where I'd want to maintain some detail in the stucco, so it's still red as stucco, for example. And at the same time, I didn't want it to be too dark. And then I would also read these dark doors right here, just to assess how deep into the shadows they were going to fall, and also shadows such as this one right here, which is a very deep shadow in the back lane between these two buildings. And I'd probably take some other readings too, including the pavement and what have you. So using that information, all garnered from my exposure meter, I would then start to build a picture, an idea of how I wanted that picture to appear. And what I would do, for example, is I would place in the zone system, I would place my exposure in what's termed as a zone 7 or a zone 8. A zone 7 would have a fair bit of detail in the white still left. And then I would probably place these dark shadows, I'd want to place them in zone 3, which still had deep shadows but still had some detail in them. And then probably I would have let these very deep shadows in the back plane just fall black because it was detail that I wasn't really concerned about capturing at all. So that's how I would look at assessing this picture, and I would determine an exposure based on that. And also based on that, I could decide, well, if this was in zone 7 and my actual meter reading placed this in zone 2, I would know from that perhaps I would have to alter my development of the negative when I got back to my darkroom, and perhaps dilute the developer a bit more so that I would decrease the contrast of the image, so that would then place the front doors of this theater back into zone 3 as opposed to zone 2, where there would still be some shadow detail. Anyways, that's sort of the fundamentals of using the zone system. And of course, the beauty of the zone system in this kind of situation is that I'm able to pretty much pre-visualize exactly how this picture is going to appear in the end. Now, granted, you know, when I go into the darkroom, I can still do lots of changes at that point. I can change the grade of my paper to increase or decrease the contrast of the picture once I got into the printing stage. And I could also do my dodging and my burning in of various areas to alter the overall look of the picture as well. But overall, before I even pressed the shutter of this, I had an idea of how this picture was going to look when I went into the darkroom to try to print it. So that's how I used the zone system back then. And now we're going to talk about how to understand the zone system. So a key to understanding it is basically the construction of a zone ruler or a zone scale using a specific film. And the how-to instructions I used years ago, and once again for my current Polaroid work, are from a book called The New Zone System Manual, published in 1976. And the authors are Minor White, a very famous photographer, Richard Zakia and Peter Lorenz. So the idea in this book was to photograph a white subject, a white textured subject, based on an exposure meter reading of the subject and based on the ISO or the film speed of the film that I was using. Now, because all exposure meters are designed to read any subject they are pointed to as a neutral 18% gray, it will see a white towel as basically a neutral gray. And zone 5, which is this one right here, in Ansel Adams' zone system, is this 18% gray, which is a rather darkish gray tone. So once the zone 5 exposure is made, then I would make a bunch of other exposures taken at 1 EV intervals. So I would take one at EV minus 1, which would be then a zone 4, an EV minus 2, which would be a zone 3, an EV minus 2, which would be a zone 2, and then so on. And then at the other side of zone 5, I would take an EV plus 1, which would be a zone 6, EV plus 2, which would be a zone 7, and again, so on up until we get to zone 9. So just a side note, I'm tossing around this term EV or exposure value. This is really a handy neutral term that describes one full f-stop difference or one full shutter speed difference. For example, an EV plus 1 describes a change in aperture setting from an f8 to an f5.6, or a shutter speed setting from 1/500th of a second to 1/250th of a second. So if you have an exposure meter and you're pointing at a subject and it indicates an exposure reading of or exposure value of EV of 13 for a given subject, let's say with an ISO 100 film, I could use an exposure of f8 at 1/25th second, or I could use an exposure of f5.6 at 1/250th of a second, and both will result in the same EV 13 exposure, and both will produce pictures that should be identical, except of course changing an aperture from f8 to f5.6 will reduce the depth of field of the picture. So When I'm building a zone ruler for conventional black and white films like Ilford HP5, the negatives would be developed normally, and then each film frame would be printed in exactly the same way, using the same exposure, same development time, same paper, and so on. And then laying the prints out in order from EV-5 to EV+4 would show a zone as a stepped grayscale, much as what you see right here. And that stepped grayscale would stretch from a solid black, zone 0, down here to a untextured white, which is zone 9 right here at the other end. So as I mentioned before, a zone 3 would, for example, represent a shadow or a dark area with textures still visible, and a zone 8 would represent a bright highlight that had very minimal texture value in it. So with conventional film, the photographer could take readings of a subject and determine if the shadow and highlight areas are falling in the desired zones, and if not, determine if the development time should be changed, for example, by increasing or decreasing the development dilution to bring those tones into the desired zones. And this is something Adams would call N+1 or N-1 development, or it could be N+2 or N-2 development. And that is something that would be determined or pre-visualized even before the photo was taken, as I used in the example of this picture in Carmen, Manitoba. Adapting the zone system to SX-70 film is limited by the baked-in structure of the SX-70 film. And because the exposing, negative development, and printing are all done in the self-contained or integral environment of the SX-70 film, there is no way to alter the development time in order to increase or decrease the tonal range of the negative. And there's certainly no opportunity to enhance the print quality by adjusting the paper grades or development time or doing any dodging or burning in, and so on and so forth. With the SX-70 film, it all happens in 15 minutes or so once the film is ejected from the camera. Really, all the photographer can do is just watch. Therefore, the application of the zone system with SX-70 film is pretty much limited to the selection of a good exposure time before the shutter is even pressed. So anyways, that's enough background. Now I think it's time to build our zone ruler. Okay, so this is my obviously temporary setup for taking my zone system pictures. I'm in the dining room of our antique house. It's a house that dates back to 1913, and as you can tell by the noise, it has fairly squeaky wood floors, so you're going to be hearing that throughout this little bit of the video. What I've done is I've set up a target area. This is basically just a white terry cloth hand towel. It doesn't have to be necessarily that large. What I've done is it does have a texture on it, and that texture is very important for the doing your zone system pictures. So anyways, I've taken that hand towel and I've mounted it on a piece of corrugated cardboard and just taped it and stretched it on the back with just masking tape. That's held to the sliding panel doors in our dining room. These are nice doors, but I've attached it temporarily with this green painter's tape so I don't take off the finish of the doors. Anyway, so that's the target. Now I also have my two lights, of course, and these are a couple of 50-watt daylight balanced, very basic studio kinds of lamps set up on lampstands. They're set up so they're evenly on either side of the center of this image. And they're set up at 45-degree angles. So the idea is that you want to set it up so that you get a fairly even light across this towel. The other thing you want to do is you want to try to find a place that is a fairly dark room that doesn't have a lot of daylight coming in, because you're dealing with Polaroid. It could take some time to take all of your pictures. You don't want the outside light influencing your pictures, so it's better to do it in a darker room, which is why this dining room is fairly good. It doesn't have a lot of daylight coming into it. In the center here, I have my camera, of course. This is my Mint SLR 670S camera with the time machine attached. Using this meter or whatever meter you happen to have on hand You want to take a reading of your towel, and then you want to select, then from that you want to make sure your ISO is set up for the speed of the film. Naturally, I'm doing tests on Polaroid 600 film, which has an ISO of 640, give or take a half stop here or there, and that's pretty much it. Once you've got set up, then you can start taking your pictures for the zone system ruler that you'll be creating. Okay, I think that's it, and we'll get back to the pictures themselves. So welcome back. As I mentioned, there's a few important equipment requirements. First of all, the camera must allow manual adjustments of either the shutter speeds or aperture f-stops, or both. And that requires a camera such as the Mint camera SLR 670S, which I reviewed in an earlier post. You might want to take a look at that. Anyways, this little camera, it's a modified SX-70, and it has this little time machine gadget that attaches to the top of it. And this allows me to change the shutter speeds between 1/2 of a second and 1/2000th of a second. So the second thing you need is a good spot meter to take detailed readings of shadows, highlights, and midtones of a scene. Now, since late 1970s, I've been using an Asahi Pentax Spot Meter 5, which allows me to take a 1-degree spot meter reading of a scene. And now this meter happens to be long out of production, but used units can be found at a reasonable price on eBay, so take a look around there. And while you're on eBay, take a look for the inexpensive Zone 6 sticker that can be applied over the spot meter's exposure dial. And this is a pretty useful aid for just converting EV readings from the meter into zones on the exposure dial. Now, alternatively, there's several smartphone exposure meter apps that also have spot meter functions, and of those I'd probably recommend the free version of Lumu Power Light Meter or LightMe. And LightMe can also emulate basic zone system functionality. Now, a third option is that many DSLRs, such as my own Olympus OMD EM1, have a built-in spot meter option that you can use. So the third thing you're going to need is an 80% gray card. Not terribly expensive, and I happen to have a bunch of these kicking around, old Kodak gray cards kicking around, but you can certainly find them easily enough online at B&H Photo, for example, or at your local camera store. So get yourself one or a stack of those. Now, of course, the other thing you're going to need is film. And now all of my tests were done on Polaroid 600 film, which has an ISO rating of 640. It would be preferable to have several packs, all with the same production date and number, and these production dates are all noted on the side of each film box, so take a look at those and try to get them to match. Now, anyways, let's get down to brass tacks. We're going to get rid of some of this stuff here, move it to the side, and I'll start to show you how the project was done. So I started by taking a reading of the white target with my spot meter set to ISO 640, and from there I determined the correct shutter speed for the camera's f8 aperture and transferred this to the shutter dial on the Mint camera's time machine. Now, if you try this experiment yourself and you find that your meter is falling between shutter speeds at f8 setting, for example between 1/25th of a second and 1/60th of a second, then adjust the lights further or closer to the target to get a definite shutter speed at f8. You'd want to, for example, to get exactly 1/25th of a second at f8. So the first picture was developed at room temperature for 15 minutes, and that was my zone 5 image. Again, even though the target is white, the exposure meter reads it as an 80% gray card, and by taking the Kodak gray card and overlapping the SX-70 image area, I can compare the gray of the card to the image, and they need to be a fairly close match. Now, SX-70 images, whether it's the 600 film or the original SX-70 film, tend to have a color cast, and it could vary between green midtones or pink highlights, or some combination of the both. Both of those are common. And that can make the comparison kind of difficult, and in that case squinting sometimes helps. So the first photo I took was a bit too dark by about 1/2 EV, and I had to retake it, so I moved the lights closer until there was a 1/2 EV difference, took another photo at the same shutter speed, and then this one was a much closer match to the gray card. That's what you're looking at here. But then this also means that the film pack speed is much slower, or it is slower than its advertised speed by 1/2 EV. So for a Polaroid 600 film, this particular pack of Polaroid 600 film with a stated film speed of 640, ISO 640, well, my test would suggest that the actual speed of this pack is ISO 480. And just to explain how I derived that, 2 times change in the ISO speed of a film from 640 to 320 is the equivalent of 1 EV. So therefore, 1/2 EV is midway between the two. Now with the zone 5 pinned down, I could then shoot the other zones by adjusting the shutter speed one at a time and taking a picture at each setting. For example, if 1/25th of a second is a good zone 5 exposure, then I would take 4 more at 1/250th of a second, which would be my zone 4, and 1/500th of a second, which would be my zone 3, and then 1/1000th, which would be my zone 2. Then I would take 3 more at the lower shutter speed, so 1/60th of a second would be my zone 6, and 1/30th of a second would be my zone 7, and 1/15th of a second would be my zone 8. Now I discounted zone 0 and zone 9 exposures because they're well outside the range of any Polaroid film, so there's really no sense wasting film on these. Now, there's only 8 films in a pack, so it really takes 2 packs to capture all 9 zones. And this means I would have to take a second zone 5 image with the new film pack and make sure it matches the zone 5 image on the first pack, which is actually pretty hard to achieve. Now, these round 1 photographs turned out to be actually quite a mess. Polaroid film packs seem to have different effective film speeds, and I also ran into shutter speed issues with my Mint camera. I discovered that the 1/60th of a second shutter speed on my camera was off by full shutter speed and actually clocks in at about 1/25th of a second. So if you look at these, for example, you can see that my zone 4 and my zone 3 pictures look pretty much identical. And if you look at my zone 4 picture, it was taken at 1/60th of a second. And my zone 3 picture was taken at 1/25th of a second. So obviously there's something amuck there, and that was something that I only found out after taking this first round. So I repeated the entire project by shifting my lights further from the target and using a different range of shutter speeds. Let's take a look at those. So lay them out here to zone 3, zone 4, zone 5, zone 6, zone 7, and zone 8. There we have it. And you notice again that there's a problem here. Is my zone 6 looks fairly close, too close to my zone 5 exposure. And if I take a look at those again at the back, here's my zone 5 exposure was at 1/60th of a second, and my zone 6 was at 1/60th of a second. My zone 5 was at 1/25th of a second. So again, you're seeing that in both of these cases, the 1/60th of a second exposure is off. The shutter speed on my camera is off by one full shutter speed, or 1 full EV. So that's a little bit of a problem, and it meant that I really had to try to avoid using the 1/60th of a second, not just for this test, but for any future work I'm going to do with this camera, unless of course I send it in to get it repaired, if it can be even repaired. So for round 2, I repeated the entire process, this time avoiding the 1/60th of a second shutter speed. So with my first pack of film, and before we get on, let me just show you, here's the first pack of film that I used, 2, 3, 4, and 5, not labeled there. Okay. In this case, I pinned my zone 5 exposure at 1/25 of a second, and it took a couple of times moving the lights back and forth to get my zone 5 so that it matched the gray card. And then I took my other pictures going down to zone 2 using progressively higher shutter speeds from there. Then with my second pack, I again had to zero in on a zone 5 exposure that matched the first pack. So that's my best match, my next pack of film. So that turned out to be a 1/15 of a second exposure. And then I took my zone 6, my 7, and zone 8 then at progressively slower shutter speeds, in other words letting more light in to make them brighter. Now as it turned out, matching the zone 5 exposures of the two film packs was a pretty difficult proposition. Polaroid's pretty upfront that the film speed can vary plus or minus 1/3 EV, and true enough, the film speed of my two packs were different. The first was ISO 533 and the second was ISO 320. Compounding the problem is that the color tone shifted as well between the first pack and the second pack. So the first pack had a fairly nice neutral gray tone, and then the second pack had that sort of greenish tone. So trying to eyeball match the greenish tone zone 5 photograph to a grayish zone 5 photo is kind of difficult. And it wasn't until I scanned the images and then desaturated them all in Photoshop to eliminate the color shift that it was pretty clear that I didn't really get a good zone 5 match. So, kind of a failure. For round 3, I decided to streamline the range of zones to 6. And this allowed me to take zone 2 to zone 7 photos, as well as 2 photos to zero in on an accurate zone 5, all using just one pack of film. Now all my previous tests were showing a lot more latitude in the shadows than in the highlights, so it seemed reasonable to sacrifice a zone 8 in favor of a zone 2. By doing this way also, I was able to avoid the 1/60th of a second shutter speed issue by taking the entire series above this speed. So I set my zone 7 exposure at 1/25th of a second and shot at progressively higher shutter speeds up to 1/2000th of a second, which was my zone 3 exposure. And then because 1/2000th of a second is the highest shutter speed on my SLR-670 camera, I put a 2 times or -1 EV neutral density filter over the lens for my zone 2 exposure. Finally, success. So the final set of 6 zone photos were all nicely graded across from zone 2 to zone 7, and they fully captured what the Polaroid 600 film is capable of. But I think right now, I think that's enough for one video. In part 2 of using the zone system with Polaroid SX-70 film, which I plan to post likely next week, I'll make sense of my stack of telephotos and create a zone ruler and show some examples of images taken using the zone system. But just as a teaser, here's an image taken in a high contrast situation. I used the zone system to determine where the important shadows and bright highlights would fall and chose an exposure time based on my pre-visualization of how I wanted the scene to look. And I managed to get it right on the first shot. So anyways, stay tuned for more zone system action. In the meantime, I've listed the products and the books mentioned down below, and you can read the blog version of this video at whatclickmake.com. So until next week or so, adios and happy shooting.